A millionaire father returns home, only to discover his little girl is being secretly abused by her cruel stepmother. What happens next will shock you. The city was alive with its usual hum, cars streaming down avenues lined with glowing towers, but inside the top floor of one of the most prestigious skyscrapers in Manhattan, there was silence. Samuel Walker sat at his oak desk, the weight of an empire pressing against his shoulders, though no trace of fatigue showed on his sharp face. At 45, Samuel had built everything men envied: wealth, influence, a sprawling estate outside the city, and a reputation that reached across oceans. A Rolex clung to his wrist, catching the light from a chandelier above, while polished leather shoes rested against the glass floor that looked down upon the glittering city. To any outsider, this was the portrait of success. But inside Samuel's chest there was only a gnawing emptiness, the hollow that had opened the day he lost his first wife, Sarah. Sarah had been the center of his world, the one who softened the hard edges of his ambition. Their daughter Emily had inherited her gentle smile, a little girl who once filled the house with laughter. Later, their son Michael was born, but his birth cost Sarah her life. From that moment, Samuel's mansion had turned from a home into a monument of silence. He buried himself in business, traveling across continents, signing contracts, chasing numbers, as if running fast enough could keep grief from catching him. And in his absence, another woman stepped into the house, Veronica. Veronica had been Sarah's close friend, always present in times of need, her face framed with golden hair and a radiant smile that promised warmth. To Samuel, she had seemed heaven-sent, a graceful presence who cared for the children when he could not. She cooked, read bedtime stories, comforted the baby. In her, Samuel thought he had found salvation, someone who could restore what he could not bring himself to face. Grateful and weary, he had placed trust in her, believing his children were safe under her care. But tonight was different. Samuel had just signed the last page of a contract, the golden pen resting with a soft click against the desk. He leaned back in his chair, his reflection in the tall glass behind him looking both powerful and unbearably lonely. For reasons he could not explain, an urge stirred within him, the need to return home, unannounced, without warning. He imagined Emily's face lighting up in surprise, imagined holding Michael in his arms, something he had not done for months. For the first time in a long while, a hint of warmth touched his heart. He stood abruptly, gathering his coat, and left before his secretary could ask where he was going. The black limousine waited downstairs, engine purring. The driver opened the door, but Samuel only gave a short nod and slid into the leather seat. As the car sped through the night, skyscrapers gave way to the darker stretches of highway, and then to the shadowy outlines of trees as the suburbs approached. Samuel's estate appeared after the iron gates swung open, a grand mansion rising against the night sky, windows glowing softly, as though promising warmth inside. Yet as Samuel stepped through the double doors, the silence that greeted him was not the warmth of home, but the stillness of something unsettled. The air was heavy, the kind of quiet that makes the hairs on the back of the neck stand up. He placed his briefcase on the marble table, removed his coat, and called softly, "Emily? Michael?" His voice echoed faintly in the high-ceilinged hall, but no cheerful footsteps came running. No laughter. Then, from deeper within the house, a faint sound reached his ears. He froze. It was the thin, broken cry of a baby. "Michael." The sound pierced the silence, weak and tremulous. Samuel's chest tightened. He moved quickly down the hallway, polished shoes tapping against marble. Just as he turned a corner, another voice reached him, fragile and quivering. "Please, please don't hurt me and my brother anymore." Samuel's heart stopped. His body stiffened, blood running cold. That voice, it was Emily, his little girl. He pressed himself against the wall, not daring to step into view just yet. His breath came shallow as he edged closer to the doorway leading into the living room. And there, through the narrow crack, he saw a scene that made his chest burn with disbelief. Emily, only 6 years old, sat on the floor, her once pink dress now stained and frayed, her soft brown hair tangled in knots. In her thin arms she clutched baby Michael tightly, his small face red from crying, his fists waving helplessly in the air. Emily's shoulders shook as she tried to hush him, whispering words of comfort through her own tears. She looked so fragile, so small, as though one harsh word might shatter her entirely. Standing across from them was Veronica. The perfect Veronica, dressed in a form-fitting red gown, her golden hair curled immaculately, her lips painted with a flawless smile. But the smile was nowhere to be seen now. Her eyes flashed cold, and her voice sliced through the room like glass. "Shut up," she snapped, her hand raised threateningly. "How many times must I tell you not to bother me with your crying? If you don't obey, I'll throw both of you out into the cold. Do you hear me?" Emily sobbed harder, clutching Michael closer. "Please don't." Samuel's breath caught in his throat, his entire body trembling with shock. This was what had been happening in his absence. The woman he had trusted, the woman he had believed to be his children's guardian, was standing there like a tyrant before them. For a brief moment he wanted to storm into the room, to tear Veronica away from them and hold his children in his arms. But his feet stayed rooted, his mind torn between rage and disbelief. Then, in an instant, Veronica's expression shifted. She glanced toward the hallway as if sensing someone's presence, and her entire demeanor melted into sweetness. Her hand lowered, her voice softened. She turned just as Samuel finally stepped into the room. "You're back," she exclaimed, her face breaking into a radiant smile, as though she had just been caught in the middle of a tender moment. "I was only teaching them a little discipline. Children can be so difficult when they don't listen, you know." Emily froze, her sobs stifled, her small body trembling as she pressed Michael's face into her shoulder. Her wide, tear-filled eyes darted toward her father, hope and fear mixing together in one desperate gaze. Samuel's heart pounded. He wanted to run to her, to lift her up, to tell her everything was all right. Yet Veronica stepped closer, her perfume clouding the air between them, her hand brushing lightly against his sleeve. "You must be so tired," she said sweetly. "Don't trouble yourself over childish fussing. Sit, relax, I'll prepare dinner." But Samuel's eyes never left Emily. He saw her grip the fabric of her dress until her knuckles turned white. He saw the purple shadow of a bruise beneath her sleeve. He saw the fear that lingered even when Veronica smiled. And something deep inside him, something he had buried beneath work and grief, began to stir. Still he said nothing. His throat was dry, his thoughts tangled. He forced himself to move slowly, setting his briefcase aside, watching Veronica retreat into her role as the perfect wife, the caretaker, the angel he had once believed her to be. Yet the echo of Emily's broken plea refused to fade. "Please don't hurt me and my brother anymore." The words rang in his mind like a vow unfulfilled, like a wound freshly opened. As he watched Veronica glide gracefully toward the kitchen, her red dress whispering against the floor, Samuel's eyes drifted back to his daughter huddled on the carpet. And in that moment, for the first time in many months, Samuel Walker no longer felt like a businessman or a grieving widower. He felt like a father, one who had been blind for far too long. The weight of silence stretched across the grand room, broken only by Michael's uneven sobs and Emily's trembling attempts to soothe him. Samuel stood there, his hand tightening into a fist at his side, though his face remained unreadable. He had spent years negotiating with men who wore masks of charm, reading their subtle betrayals between the lines of contracts. But nothing in all those years of boardrooms and business deals had prepared him for the sight of his daughter, shrinking into herself in fear. He swallowed hard, his throat thick, forcing his voice into calmness though it quivered deep beneath. "Emily," he said softly, "come here." The little girl lifted her head, her eyes glistening with tears. For a moment, hope flickered across her fragile face, but just as quickly, it was replaced by hesitation. Her hands clutched Michael tighter, as though afraid someone might snatch him away if she let go. The seconds stretched unbearably. Samuel held out his arms, but his daughter remained frozen, caught between instinctive trust and a terror that made her small body rigid. Veronica, ever watchful, stepped in with perfect timing. Her smile widened as though to erase the tension. She glided across the room in her elegant dress, her voice dripping with honey. "Sweetheart," she cooed, bending down beside Emily, "your father's home. Why don't you show him how good you've been? Come on now." She laid her hand gently, too gently, on Emily's shoulder, but Samuel's sharp eyes caught the subtle tightening of her grip, the way Emily's shoulders stiffened under her touch. Samuel's jaw tightened. He moved forward, reaching out awkwardly. It had been so long since he'd held Michael that his arms felt unsteady. "Let me," he said, his voice firmer now. Veronica hesitated just long enough for Samuel to notice before releasing the child into his arms. Michael's tiny body felt too light, his frame thin under the baby clothes. He cried louder at first, but as Samuel adjusted his hold and began rocking him gently, the wailing softened into hiccuping sobs. Samuel's throat constricted as he whispered, "You're safe now, son. Daddy's here." Words he hadn't spoken in months slipped out naturally, cutting him with guilt as much as with love. Emily's wide eyes lifted toward him, brimming with something unspoken. For the first time in months, Samuel saw not only his daughter, but the small child who had once run barefoot across the garden, laughing as her mother clapped from the porch. That memory rose like a blade, Sarah's absence more piercing than ever. But before he could dwell on it, Veronica interjected smoothly, her tone light and dismissive. "You see? He's just fussy. I told you children cry all the time. I've been handling them while you've been away." She brushed her hair back with a practiced gesture, smiling sweetly. "But you must be tired. Why don't you go wash up while I finish dinner? Everything will be ready soon." Her words were polished, but Samuel caught the flicker in her eyes, a flash of something sharp, something venomous, gone as quickly as it appeared. Emily, however, had seen it too. She ducked her head immediately, pulling the frayed hem of her dress over her knees as if to hide. Dinner was served not long after. The long mahogany table gleamed under the chandelier, silver cutlery neatly arranged, the scent of roasted chicken and soup rising warmly. To any guest, the dining room would have seemed a portrait of wealth and comfort. Yet beneath the golden light, Samuel felt an undercurrent of tension that soured every bite. He sat at the head of the table, Veronica at his right, Emily across from him, and Michael in a small high chair. Mrs. Whitman, the elderly housekeeper who had been with the family since Sarah's time, stood discreetly in the corner, hands folded. Her eyes lowered, her posture proper, yet Samuel noticed her glance toward Emily more than once, worry flickering behind her otherwise composed face. "Eat, sweetheart, so you'll grow strong," Veronica said in a voice sweet enough to curdle honey. She reached across to place a piece of meat into Emily's bowl. To Samuel's eye, it looked like a kind gesture. But he caught the way Veronica's hand pressed too firmly on the girl's small shoulder, the way Emily flinched slightly under her touch. Samuel leaned forward, studying his daughter carefully. That's when he noticed faint purple marks around her left wrist, thin, stretched bruises, half hidden beneath the sleeve of her dress. His chest constricted. He set his spoon down slowly. "Emily," he asked, his voice heavy but calm, "has anyone at school been bullying you?" Emily startled. Her eyes widened, then darted quickly toward Veronica before dropping to her lap. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. No, father." Veronica let out a soft laugh, shaking her head lightly. "Children bump into each other all the time when they play," she said. "I've told her to be more careful. You know how clumsy she can be." Her words were casual, but her gaze flickered toward Samuel as if daring him to challenge her. Samuel's stomach tightened with guilt. For months, he had drowned himself in work, convincing himself that leaving the children with Veronica was better than them growing up with a cold, absent father. But sitting here, watching his daughter's trembling hands, he felt the weight of every day he had not been home. Michael whimpered suddenly, kicking his legs and letting out a wail. Veronica immediately stood, circling around to lift him from the chair. But Samuel noticed her hands, how she gripped the baby under the arms too tightly, without tenderness. Michael screamed louder, his small face red with distress. "Give him to me," Samuel said quickly, standing. His voice cracked with urgency. Veronica hesitated only a second before handing Michael over, her lips pressed into a strained smile. Samuel caught the child against his chest, rocking him gently. Though stiff at first, his arms soon found a rhythm, patting the boy's back, whispering soothing words. Michael's cries softened gradually, his small head pressing against his father's shoulder. Emily lifted her gaze, her eyes wide with both surprise and fragile hope. Samuel caught the look, and it struck him like a knife, as if his own daughter no longer knew if she could trust his arms. Dinner dragged on. Veronica filled the silence with talk of Samuel's recent business trip, the investments he had secured, the future projects she had read about. Her tone was cheerful, polished, practiced. Sometimes she turned to Emily with half-hearted questions. "Did you practice your piano? Did you help in the garden?" Her words light, her smile sweet, though her hand brushed against the child's arm with just enough pressure to make Emily's shoulders stiffen. Mrs. Whitman remained in the corner, silent. But once, when Samuel looked toward her, he caught her gaze. And in that brief moment, the old woman's eyes revealed more than words could ever say: unease, sorrow, helplessness. She quickly lowered her head again, but Samuel's heart clenched. Something was terribly wrong in his house. After the plates were cleared, Veronica leaned closer to him, her perfume heavy in the air. "You came home early tonight. You surprised me," she said, her tone soft and inviting. "I'll make sure dessert is ready. You should relax, darling. Don't let the children's fussing disturb you." Samuel nodded faintly, his mind elsewhere. He stood, adjusting Michael in his arms. "I'm going upstairs to change," he said. His voice was steady, but inside, anger and guilt knotted tightly. He handed Michael back to Veronica, watching closely this time as her thumb pressed into the child's side, too hard for comfort. Samuel's lips pressed into a thin line. He turned toward the staircase, each step creaking softly beneath his feet. But at the fourth step, he froze. From the dining room came the faint clink of glasses, the scrape of a chair, and then Veronica's voice, no longer honeyed, no longer sweet. It was sharp, low, venomous. "Listen carefully," she hissed. "If you dare tell your father anything, I will throw you and your brother out on the street. Do you understand?" A pause followed. Then came the sound of shallow, trembling breaths. Emily's voice, broken, strangled, whispered, "Please, please don't. I'll stay quiet. I promise." Samuel gripped the banister, so hard his knuckles whitened. His heart pounded against his ribs like a drum of war. His vision blurred for a moment as fury coursed through him, mingling with guilt so deep it nearly made him sick. He had trusted Veronica, left his children vulnerable, and now he stood listening to his daughter beg for mercy in her own home. Downstairs, Veronica's tone shifted again. Her laugh was light, almost musical, as she spoke louder, just enough for Samuel to hear. "Good girl. Now finish your food, and I'll give you dessert." The contrast twisted inside Samuel's chest, rage and disbelief choking him. He remained frozen on the step, sweat dampening his palms, his body cold despite the fire raging in his veins. He wanted to storm down, to tear Veronica away from his children. But some instinct held him still, the realization that one reckless outburst might only drive Emily deeper into silence, deeper into fear. From the corner of his eye, he noticed movement. Mrs. Whitman stepped quietly from the kitchen, her steps so soft they barely stirred the air. She glanced briefly toward the staircase, her expression heavy with unspoken knowledge. Then, without looking directly at him, she placed a folded towel on the lower banister, a small, discreet gesture, almost like a message. "You are not wrong. You are not alone." Samuel's chest heaved as he pressed his back against the wall. His mind spun with questions, memories, doubts, but through them all, a single vow took root, heavy and undeniable. "This ends now. I will not let this continue another day." He drew in a long breath, forcing the storm inside him back beneath the surface. Then, slowly, he stepped down the hall as though nothing had happened. Veronica turned toward him with her perfect smile as he re-entered the dining room. "You surprised me tonight," she said warmly, her voice flawless again. "I'll have the kitchen bring dessert." Samuel nodded slowly, masking the fury boiling inside him. His gaze flickered to Emily, who kept her head down, hands clasped tightly in her lap. His throat burned as he forced himself to speak calmly. "That won't be necessary. I'll be in the study." And with that, he turned, closing the heavy wooden door behind him. Alone in the quiet, Samuel pressed his fists against the desk, his reflection staring back from the dark glass of the window. His heart thundered as his late wife's voice seemed to whisper across the years, "Protect them. Believe their eyes. Do not ignore what you see." For the first time in months, Samuel Walker allowed himself to feel the full weight of fatherhood. The mask had cracked. The truth had begun to seep through. And though the house above remained outwardly still, within its walls a storm was gathering that would not be silenced. The night settled over the mansion like a heavy cloak, the long corridors bathed in shadows, the antique clocks ticking with a hollow rhythm that seemed to echo Samuel's thoughts. He sat alone in the study, a glass of untouched whiskey on the desk, staring into the faint glow of the fireplace. The crackle of wood did little to warm him. His mind was still replaying the whisper he had overheard, the venom in Veronica's voice, the trembling fear in Emily's reply. The memory was sharper than any business betrayal he had ever endured, more cutting than any financial loss. This wasn't about numbers or deals. This was about his children, flesh of his flesh, blood of his blood, suffering under his own roof. For a long while, Samuel did nothing but sit in the silence, his hands clenched tightly, his jaw aching from how hard he had been grinding his teeth. Anger swirled inside him like a storm begging to break, but above it all was something worse, guilt. He thought of the years he had buried himself in his work, of the late nights in hotel suites, of the endless boardrooms and applause of colleagues. He had convinced himself that he was securing their future, but what was the use of wealth if his children had to beg for safety? His late wife's face rose unbidden in his mind, her gentle eyes, her quiet voice always urging him to be present. He had promised her once, in the small hours of the night, when she was ill, that he would take care of Emily and Michael, no matter what happened. That promise now burned like a brand on his heart. A soft knock at the study door broke his thoughts. He straightened, quickly wiping the turmoil from his expression. "Come in," he called, his voice steady though his chest still heaved. The door opened just enough for Mrs. Whitman to step inside. She carried a folded linen towel in her hands, her steps deliberate and quiet. She closed the door gently behind her and stood by the desk, her posture upright, her eyes respectfully lowered. "Sir," she said softly, her voice low, almost wary. "I thought you might like some fresh cloths. The night is colder than usual." Samuel studied her for a long moment. He had known this woman since his marriage. She had helped raise Emily from the cradle, had whispered lullabies when Sarah was too weak from illness to rise from bed. There was loyalty in her bones, but tonight there was also something else. Something unspoken. He leaned back in his chair, gesturing toward the empty seat near the fire. "Sit for a moment, Mrs. Whitman." The old housekeeper hesitated, then obeyed, lowering herself gracefully onto the chair, folding her hands in her lap. Her face remained composed, but Samuel could see the faint tremor in her fingers. "I want you to speak freely with me," Samuel began, his voice even but edged with steel. "I've been gone too long. I need to know what I have missed. About my children. About this house." Mrs. Whitman's eyes flickered upward, just for a second, then dropped again. For a while she said nothing, as if weighing every word, measuring the cost of honesty. When she finally spoke, her voice was hushed, almost trembling. "Sir, I have tried to do what I could," she said. "But there are things that no servant should speak of, unless asked directly. And now that you ask, I cannot remain silent." Samuel's heart pounded. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on her. "Tell me." Mrs. Whitman clasped her hands tighter, the wrinkles in her skin deepening under the firelight. "Miss Emily, she has been treated harshly. Too harshly for a child. Locked away in the storage room when she displeased her stepmother. Made to scrub the floors until her little hands bled. She eats less than she should, though I do what I can to slip her food." Her voice caught briefly, but she pressed on. "And Master Michael, he is often left crying in his crib for hours. He has not thrived as a baby should. I fear he is weaker than he ought to be." Samuel felt a chill crawl across his skin. He gripped the armrest of his chair so tightly that the leather creaked. "And Veronica?" he asked slowly, his tone so low it was almost a growl. Mrs. Whitman hesitated again, then nodded slightly. "Her temper is not what she shows you, sir. In your presence, she is gentle. But when you are away, she changes. She scolds the children, punishes them without mercy. Miss Emily has borne the worst of it, shielding her brother as best she can. She has learned to keep quiet, to hide her tears." The firelight flickered across Samuel's face, casting shadows that deepened the fury etched into his features. Inside him, the storm broke. Every instinct as a father roared within him, demanding he storm upstairs that very moment, tear Veronica away from his children, and banish her from the house. But another voice, colder, sharper, the voice of the strategist he had always been, whispered that he needed proof. He could not afford a confrontation built on rage alone. Veronica was cunning, manipulative, and if he challenged her without evidence, she might twist the truth, turning the children's terror into lies against him. He forced his voice to remain calm, though it shook with restrained fury. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitman, for your honesty. You've done more for my children than I have. But things will change now. I will see to it." The housekeeper's eyes glistened briefly, and she lowered her head. "They need you, sir, more than ever." When she left, the study fell silent again, but Samuel's thoughts were no longer clouded with doubt. He had confirmation. His daughter's bruises, her fearful eyes, the whispered threats, they were not fragments of imagination. They were truth. Bitter, undeniable truth. Later that night, long after the house had quieted, Samuel rose from his chair and climbed the grand staircase. The halls were still, the lamps dimmed. He moved with careful steps, pausing outside Emily's room. A thin line of light leaked from beneath the door, faint as a ghost. He knocked softly. There was no answer, only the muffled sound of rustling fabric. He opened the door gently. Inside, Emily sat on the floor beside her bed, Michael cradled in her lap. The girl was whispering softly, her voice cracked but tender, telling him a story about a garden where their mother once walked, about birds that sang only for kind children. The baby's small fists clutched her sleeve, his face pressed into her shoulder. When Emily saw her father, she startled, her body stiffening as though she had been caught doing something forbidden. She quickly wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Father," she whispered, her voice trembling. Samuel's chest tightened. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. For a moment, he could not find his words. All he could do was kneel beside his daughter, his hand hovering before gently brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. Her skin was pale, her eyes ringed with shadows far too old for her years. "You don't need to be afraid of me, Emily," he said softly, his voice breaking despite himself. "You can tell me anything. Do you understand? Anything." Emily's lips parted, but no words came. Her gaze darted to the door, then back to him. Her arms tightened protectively around Michael. And then, with a trembling voice, she whispered only 2 words. "She'll know." Samuel swallowed hard, his throat burning. He didn't press her further. Instead, he pulled them both into his arms, holding them close, his chin resting on Emily's hair. For the first time in too long, he allowed himself to simply hold his children, feeling the fragile weight of them against his chest. As he rocked them gently, his eyes fell on the bedside drawer left slightly ajar. Inside, he noticed folded sheets of paper, yellowed with time. Carefully, he reached in and drew one out. The handwriting struck him instantly, delicate, familiar, his late wife's script. His heart stopped as he read the first line. "To Samuel, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer here to speak these words aloud. Protect Emily and Michael. Trust their eyes, they will not know how to lie." Samuel's breath caught. His wife's words, written long before her death, seemed to echo through the room, cutting through every doubt that had ever lingered in his heart. He pressed the letter to his chest, his eyes burning with unshed tears. In that moment, the path before him became clear. He would no longer allow Veronica's cruelty to remain hidden in the shadows. He would uncover every secret, gather every truth, and when the time was right, he would bring her to ruin. Emily clung to him, her small voice barely audible as she whispered into his shoulder, "Please don't leave us again, Father." Samuel closed his eyes, his arms tightening around both of his children. His answer was not spoken aloud, but it was carved into the depths of his heart. Never again. The following morning, sunlight spilled into the grand dining hall through tall windows, casting golden stripes across the polished floor. The mansion, so often filled with an air of lifeless luxury, seemed almost alive with brightness, yet Samuel felt none of its warmth. He sat at the head of the long oak table, sipping black coffee, his expression unreadable. Across from him, Veronica glided in, elegant as ever, her silk robe tied neatly at the waist, her face painted with the effortless charm she had perfected. "Good morning, darling," she said smoothly, pressing a kiss against his cheek as though the previous night's venom had never left her lips. Her perfume lingered too sweetly in the air, a fragrance that suddenly felt suffocating. Samuel smiled faintly, but inside his heart hardened. Last night's revelations, and the letter from his late wife, had burned away the last remnants of doubt. The woman standing before him was no partner, no mother. She was an impostor cloaked in grace, a predator feeding on innocence. But he would not confront her with rage. Not yet. He would play her game, wear the mask she expected, and watch her trap herself in the lies she thought invisible. Emily entered quietly with Michael in her arms, her steps hesitant, her eyes lowered. Veronica's smile flickered, just for an instant, before she plastered on her sugary sweetness. "Emily, darling, sit down. Breakfast is ready," she said, her tone so syrupy it almost stung. She poured juice into a crystal glass, sliding it toward the child with exaggerated gentleness. Samuel caught the slight twitch of Emily's shoulders, the way she hesitated before taking the seat, her little hands clutching her brother protectively. Every movement was a language of fear, one Samuel could finally read now that his eyes were open. The meal passed with strained politeness, Veronica chatting about trivial matters, charity galas, acquaintances, a new boutique opening in the city, while Samuel responded with calculated nods and soft chuckles. All the while, his gaze shifted subtly between her and the children, observing the undercurrent she thought hidden. He noticed how Emily flinched when Veronica's hand brushed her shoulder, how the baby quieted only when pressed against his sister, never toward the stepmother. Each detail was another stone in the fortress of proof he was silently building. After breakfast, Veronica excused herself to make calls. Samuel rose, feigning casualness. "I'll take a walk through the gardens," he said. His tone was light, almost careless, but his mind was sharp as a blade. The estate gardens were vast, trimmed hedges stretching like walls of green, roses blooming in carefully sculpted rows. He strolled along the gravel path, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression composed. Yet as he rounded the corner near the secluded arbor, voices reached his ears, hushed, urgent, and unmistakably Veronica's. He paused, keeping himself hidden behind a wall of ivy. "You'll get the transfer soon," Veronica's voice whispered sharply. But not until he signs the papers. The inheritance is tied up in those trusts. Once I convince him to adjust the guardianship, everything will flow exactly as we planned. Another voice, a man's, unfamiliar and coarse, replied, "And the children?" Veronica's response was cold enough to freeze the blood in Samuel's veins. "They'll be managed. The girl is already broken. As for the boy, he's too young to remember much anyway." Samuel's jaw clenched, his breath held so tightly his chest burned. His pulse thundered, but he forced himself to remain still, absorbing every poisonous word. So it was true. She hadn't only been cruel, she had been plotting, weaving deceit around his fortune, treating his children as obstacles in her path. The man grunted. "You'd better be careful. If he suspects—" "He won't," Veronica cut in with a bitter laugh. "Samuel sees only what I allow. He trusts me blindly. By the time he realizes, it will all be too late." A surge of dark satisfaction flickered in Samuel's heart. Not this time, he thought. Not anymore. He slipped away silently, returning to the mansion with his mind blazing. The mask of ignorance she believed in would be his weapon. He would give her rope enough to hang herself, to reveal her true nature fully, before there could be any denial. The rest of the day, Samuel lingered at home, something he had rarely done in years. Veronica welcomed it, her smile radiant, as though pleased to have her husband near. But he saw the flickers of unease in her eyes, the subtle calculations behind her laughter. He joined her in the lounge, listening to her speak about future investments and family reputation. Every word was a thread, and Samuel tugged gently, watching to see where her fabric would fray. When Emily tiptoed into the room to ask if she might sit with her father, Veronica's tone turned honeyed again. "Of course, darling," she said, stroking the child's hair. But Samuel noticed the slight pressure of her hand against Emily's scalp, more forceful than it appeared, and the child's wince quickly masked by a smile. His blood simmered, but he forced a calm laugh, pulling Emily to his lap, stroking her hair gently where Veronica's fingers had pressed. That night, long after Veronica had retired, Samuel remained awake, walking the halls with deliberate steps. He paused outside the nursery, peeking in to see Emily fast asleep beside Michael's crib, her small hand resting protectively on the baby's chest. The sight both broke and strengthened him. She was too young to bear such burdens, yet she had carried them with more courage than most adults he knew. In his study once again, Samuel laid out papers, scribbling notes. He contacted his lawyer discreetly the next morning, requesting meetings under the guise of financial restructuring. He began recording small details, bruises he spotted on Emily's arms, the meals she pushed around her plate, the subtle glances of fear whenever Veronica's tone sharpened. Every observation became part of the evidence he would need. Days passed in this quiet battle of masks. Veronica played the devoted wife with flawless performance, while Samuel played the trusting husband, all the while gathering threads of her deceit. Emily, slowly sensing her father's watchful presence, began to relax in his company. One evening, while Veronica was away at a so-called charity dinner, Emily crept into Samuel's study with Michael in her arms. "Father," she whispered, standing timidly at the door. "May I sit with you?" Samuel's chest ached with tenderness. He guided her to the chair by the fire, bringing her a blanket. She curled up quietly, rocking her brother. After a long silence, she lifted her eyes to him. "Mother said you would always keep us safe." The word struck him like an arrow. His wife's letter, her fading voice and memory, and now his daughter's fragile faith in him, all converged into one truth. He had failed them once, but he would not again. He reached over, brushing Emily's cheek gently. "I will, Emily. From now on, I promise." The girl's lips trembled, her eyes brimming with tears. She tried to blink away. She nodded, clutching her brother closer. That night, Samuel stood over his sleeping children, his wife's letter clutched in his hand. The flickering candlelight cast his reflection against the window, not the cold, distracted man who had once abandoned his home for boardrooms and wealth, but a father reborn. His awakening was not loud or dramatic. It was steady, deliberate, forged in guilt, sharpened by determination. He whispered into the quiet, not for the children, not even for his late wife, but for himself, "I will not fail again." And as the mansion slept under its veil of silence, Samuel's resolve solidified. The war for his children's safety had begun, though Veronica still danced in ignorance, believing herself untouchable. But her days of power were numbered. Soon, her mask would crack, and when it did, Samuel would be ready. The mansion began to change in strange, unsettling ways. Veronica, sensing that her world was tightening, grew sharper in her performance. Where once she drifted through the halls with casual grace, now she seemed to live in constant display. Every smile was brighter, every gesture exaggerated, every word carefully dipped in honey. She laughed more loudly at Samuel's mild jokes, touched his arm more often, and made a show of fussing over the children whenever he was near. At breakfast, she placed extra berries on Emily's plate, cooing, "For my sweet girl, your favorite." Her tone was theatrical, too sweet, like syrup poured over something rotten. Samuel, sipping his coffee, said nothing, but his eyes flicked toward Emily. The child lowered her head, pushing the berries to one side, her lips pressed thin, as though the taste itself might betray her. Veronica didn't notice, or perhaps didn't care, as she continued to chatter about social luncheons and charity galas. At night, she paraded herself in gowns, swirling into Samuel's study with a glass of wine, pretending to seek his counsel on household affairs. "Darling," she said one evening, her hand gliding along the back of his chair, "I've been thinking. The children should have more structure. Too much indulgence will spoil them. We must be firm if they're to grow into proper heirs of your legacy." Her eyes gleamed when she spoke of his legacy, like a snake glimpsing treasure through grass. Samuel nodded mildly, his features calm. "You may be right," he murmured, though inside the words carved fire into him. He had heard her cruelty, he had seen it. Structure was her mask for tyranny. Discipline was her excuse for cruelty. He would not challenge her directly, not yet. He simply let her believe her performance was flawless, while every day his quiet notebook grew thicker with observations. Emily, for her part, began to sense the shift. When she dared to glance at her father, she sometimes caught his eyes softening, not with the distant glaze of distraction, but with something alive, something fierce and protective. For the first time in years, she dared to hope. Still, her fear of Veronica remained like a shadow always at her heels. The bruises on her arm faded only to be replaced by others, small, dark marks she tried to hide beneath sleeves. She never spoke of them aloud, but Samuel's trained eyes missed nothing. Each time, he wrote another line in his ledger of truth. One afternoon, Veronica suggested a family outing. "It's been too long since we enjoyed each other's company outside these walls," she declared brightly. "A picnic by the lake will do us good." She orchestrated the affair with grand gestures, blankets of silk, baskets of wine and imported delicacies, a chauffeur to drive them to the estate's private lakeside grove. On the surface, it looked perfect, a wealthy family basking in the sun, their laughter floating across the water. Veronica wore a flowing white dress, her hair glinting gold in the light, and she made a show of feeding Michael mashed fruit, dabbing his chin with a napkin. "See how much he adores me?" she sang, flashing Samuel a radiant smile. To anyone passing by, it might have seemed genuine, but Samuel's eyes were trained on the details. He saw the way Michael turned his face slightly from her spoon, his tiny fists curling tighter when she leaned too close. He noticed how Emily, sitting beside him, kept her hand on the baby's leg, as though anchoring him against some unseen tide. When Veronica turned away to pour wine into Samuel's glass, Emily seized the moment to slip a small crust of bread into her brother's hand. The gesture was quick, quiet, almost invisible, but Samuel saw. He saw everything. Later, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, Veronica suggested a walk. "Why don't you take Emily with you, darling? Bond with her. I'll stay with Michael." Her tone was light, her smile angelic, but Samuel heard the hidden edge. He had seen how Veronica treated the children when no one was looking. The thought of leaving Michael in her arms, even for a few minutes, tightened his chest. He shook his head gently. "No, let Emily stay with her brother. You and I can walk." For the briefest moment, Veronica's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. Then she recovered, looping her arm through his. "As you wish," she said. But Samuel had caught the crack in her mask. Each crack mattered. Each one was another thread in the net he was weaving around her. Back at the mansion, Veronica's performances grew more desperate. She ordered expensive toys for the children, delivered in grand packages with ribbons and bows. "Look, Emily, all for you," she exclaimed one afternoon as maids carried in a dollhouse taller than the girl herself. But Emily only stared at it in silence, her small hands tightening on Michael's shoulders. When Veronica urged her to say thank you, Emily whispered the words with mechanical obedience, her voice flat. Samuel stood in the doorway watching. To anyone else, the scene might have looked like generosity, but he knew the truth. Gifts could not erase bruises. Ribbon packages could not mask cruelty. Veronica wasn't trying to love the children. She was trying to silence them, to paint over their fear with glitter and plastic. That night, Samuel placed a discreet call to his lawyer. "Begin preparing guardianship documents," he instructed quietly. "And I want investigators. Quiet ones. Discreet. Look into her accounts, her connections, everything." The lawyer hesitated. "Do you suspect fraud, sir?" "I don't suspect," Samuel replied coldly. "I know." Over the next weeks, the trap of kindness thickened. Veronica organized charity dinners in their home, making sure Samuel was seen with her at every opportunity. She posed with the children for photographs, arranging them beside her like trophies, her smile flawless as the camera flashed. But Samuel had grown skilled at watching beneath the surface. In every image, Emily's smile never reached her eyes, and Michael's small fists always clutched his sister's dress as though for protection. When the guests were gone and the house quiet again, Samuel walked the halls with deliberate calm, taking note of the subtle tremors in Veronica's composure. She was working harder now, straining to maintain her perfect image, and in that strain lay weakness. He knew it was only a matter of time before the mask slipped completely. One evening, as the family dined under the glittering chandelier, Veronica leaned close, her voice low and silky. "Darling, about the trusts, perhaps we should discuss simplifying things. The children are still young. They don't need such complex arrangements. It would be easier if everything passed directly to me, don't you think? For their sake, of course." Samuel's fork stilled. He set it down gently, folding his hands before him. His face remained calm, his eyes steady. "Perhaps," he murmured. "We'll review it soon." Inside, fire roared through him. She had laid her ambition bare, thinly veiled as concern. He had expected it, but hearing the words spoken aloud hardened his resolve beyond return. That night, he returned once more to the nursery, watching his children sleep. Emily's hand rested over Michael's tiny chest, her body curled protectively as though even in dreams she shielded him from harm. Samuel's throat tightened. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "My brave girl," he whispered. "It won't be long now." In the quiet of that room, with the moonlight streaming across their faces, Samuel knew the time for patience was nearing its end. Veronica's trap of kindness was closing tighter, but so was his own. And unlike hers, his would not fail. For the first time in years, Samuel felt not just like a father, but like a warrior. One fighting a silent war within gilded walls. A war where every smile concealed daggers, and every gesture carried meaning. And in this war, he had one unshakable truth on his side: love. Love for the children who still clung to hope. Love for the wife whose letter had awakened him. Love that would not allow him to falter again. Veronica's reign was cracking. She just didn't know it yet. The house had grown quieter, but not in peace. It was the kind of quiet that whispered of storms beneath the surface, a silence that felt brittle, ready to shatter at the smallest touch. Veronica had tightened her grip, though her performance in front of Samuel remained polished and elegant. She floated through rooms in silk gowns, planned luncheons with her society friends, and kissed Samuel's cheek with the delicate timing of an actress who knew her cues by heart. But beneath the mask, her nerves were fraying. Samuel saw it in the way her smile slipped too quickly when she thought no one was watching. He saw it in the way her hands twitched when Emily passed her at the dining table, or the sharp flicker of impatience in her eyes when Michael cried for too long. He had studied her for weeks now, each movement carefully recorded in his mind, each inconsistency filed away like evidence in a trial. And though he spoke little of it, Samuel's presence in the house had grown more constant. His business associates noticed the shift. He canceled meetings, postponed trips, and declined invitations to conferences he once would have dominated. "Family first," he said curtly when pressed. No one dared argue. Veronica, however, noticed every moment of his newfound attentiveness, and it frightened her. She had built her power on his absence, on the distance he had allowed between himself and his children. His sudden nearness threatened everything: her control over Emily and Michael, and her steady march toward his fortune. So she grew careful. In Samuel's presence, she played the doting stepmother flawlessly. But when she believed herself unobserved, her cruelty surfaced sharper than ever. Emily bore the brunt of it. One afternoon, Samuel returned earlier than usual from the city. He walked the halls with silent steps, his senses sharpened by weeks of careful observation. From the far wing of the house came a muffled sound, the scrape of wood against tile, followed by a faint whimper. He followed it, his heart already tightening. There, in the dim light of the laundry room, he found Emily on her knees, scrubbing the stone floor with raw, reddened hands. A bucket of water stood beside her, filthy with suds. Her dress was damp and clung to her thin frame, her braid unraveling as sweat dampened her forehead. She flinched when he entered, her eyes wide with terror, as though expecting another blow. "Emily," Samuel whispered, his voice breaking. Before she could answer, a sharp click of heels echoed from behind him. Veronica's voice followed, sweet and poisonous. "Ah, there you are. I told Emily she needed to learn responsibility. She made a mess in the hallway earlier, and what better way to teach her than letting her clean it herself? Don't you agree, darling?" Samuel turned slowly, his face unreadable, though inside his fury burned hotter than ever before. He studied her, the tilt of her chin, the feigned innocence in her eyes, the way her smile never quite reached her lips. He thought of every bruise, every tremor of fear in his daughter's voice, every whisper of truth he had ignored for too long. His hand curled into a fist at his side. Emily kept her head down, scrubbing harder as if trying to erase herself from sight. "Enough," Samuel said at last, his voice low and cutting. Veronica blinked, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second. "Enough? Darling, I don't—" "Stand up, Emily," he interrupted, his tone firm, commanding. The little girl froze, then slowly rose to her feet, water dripping from her hands. She glanced nervously between them, her breath shallow. Samuel's gaze never left Veronica. What kind of woman makes a child scrub stone floors like a servant? What kind of mother punishes a little girl until her hands bleed? Her mask cracked then, the perfect smile slipping into something harder. She laughed, brittle and sharp. "Don't be dramatic, Samuel. She barely did anything. Children need discipline. You've been too soft, too distracted with your work to see it." For the first time, Samuel's voice thundered through the mansion. "Discipline is not abuse." The walls seemed to tremble with his words. Emily flinched, but this time not from fear of him, from the raw power of his rage, directed not at her but at the woman who had tormented her. Veronica's eyes narrowed. The sweetness drained away, leaving something colder, sharper. "Be careful," she hissed. "You're letting your grief blind you. You can't raise these children alone. You need me. Without me, this house will fall into chaos." Samuel stepped forward, his height casting a shadow over her. "No," he said softly, dangerously. "Without you, this house will finally be free." For the first time since their marriage, Veronica's composure faltered completely. Her mouth opened as though to argue, but the words withered on her tongue under the weight of his stare. She spun on her heel, storming out of the laundry room, her heels clicking like gunfire against the marble floor. Samuel knelt then, gently taking Emily's small, trembling hands into his own. The skin was raw, the knuckles reddened. He lifted his gaze to meet her wide, fearful eyes. "No more," he whispered. "Do you hear me, Emily? No more." Her lip trembled. She wanted to believe him, but years of fear had woven doubt too deeply into her heart. And yet, as he wrapped his arms around her fragile frame, she let herself lean into him for the first time in what felt like forever. That night, Samuel called his lawyer again. His voice was steady, but the undercurrent of rage made it vibrate with steel. "Begin the proceedings," he ordered. "I want full custody rights established immediately, and gather every piece of evidence we have. It's time." The lawyer hesitated. "Are you certain, sir? This will be a war." Samuel's eyes drifted toward the nursery, where Emily and Michael now slept safely under the watchful eye of the loyal housekeeper. "Then let it be war." From that day on, the mansion no longer belonged to Veronica. Though she still floated through its halls in silk and jewels, her power was slipping, thread by thread. Samuel no longer pretended ignorance. He no longer looked away. Every cruel glance she cast toward Emily was met with his unwavering stare. Every harsh word was cut short by his sharp reply. And Veronica, for all her venom, began to sense that the ground beneath her was crumbling. She tried harder, of course. She served Samuel his favorite dishes at dinner, poured his wine with trembling hands, and forced herself to laugh at his silence. But the trap was closing around her, and she could feel it. Late one evening, Samuel stood outside the nursery once more. He watched Emily curled protectively around her brother, just as she had so many nights before. But now, for the first time, he allowed himself a whisper of hope. He had seen the truth with his own eyes. He had confronted the monster in his home. And though the battle was far from over, the tide had shifted. Proof. Betrayal. A mask finally cracking. And Samuel, for the first time in years, no longer felt powerless. He felt like a father again. A protector. A man ready to fight. The air in the mansion grew heavy, like a storm pressing against glass windows, waiting for the right moment to break. Samuel no longer walked as the absent-minded patriarch. He moved with intent, a commander on his own battlefield. Veronica sensed it. She felt the weight of his silence, the power in his watchful eyes, and it unnerved her. Each time she smiled too brightly or spoke too sweetly, she felt his gaze cut through the act like a blade. But Samuel was patient. He understood that power was not reclaimed in haste. For weeks, he wove his web tighter, his lawyer gathering evidence, his investigator peeling back layers of Veronica's past. Debts she had hidden, lovers she had entertained before her marriage, whispers of schemes she had buried under charm. Slowly, Samuel's ledger of truth grew heavier than her arsenal of lies. And still he waited. Because he knew Veronica's nature, she could not resist revealing herself. All he needed was the right moment. That moment arrived on a cold evening in late autumn, when the house hosted one of Veronica's glittering dinner parties. The chandelier blazed, silver cutlery gleamed, and the long oak table stretched beneath velvet runners and candlelight. Politicians, businessmen, and women of high society filled the seats, their laughter mingling with the soft strains of a string quartet. Veronica was in her element. Draped in emerald silk, she floated between guests with a glass of wine in hand, her laughter bubbling like champagne. She touched arms, whispered confidences, and orchestrated conversation with the practiced grace of a queen at court. To the untrained eye, she was perfect. To Samuel, she was a predator dancing on borrowed time. Emily and Michael had been brought down for the first course, a display of family unity Veronica insisted upon. Emily sat rigid at the far end, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes cast downward. Michael squirmed beside her, reaching now and then for his sister's sleeve as though tethered to her presence. Veronica made a show of introducing them. "Our darling children," she cooed, her hand resting a little too firmly on Emily's shoulder. "Aren't they precious?" Samuel's jaw tightened. The sight of her fingers pressing into Emily's small frame made his blood burn, but he said nothing. Not yet. He watched instead, waiting for the slip he knew would come. The dinner progressed with practiced elegance until Veronica's mask cracked under the smallest of provocations. A guest, a wealthy banker with more wine than sense, leaned forward and asked, "Tell me, Mrs. Harrington, how do you manage such a large household with 2 little ones underfoot? Surely it must be exhausting." Veronica's smile sharpened, her grip on Emily's shoulder tightening. "Exhausting? Oh, they're quite manageable, if one knows how to maintain proper discipline." Her tone carried a sharper edge than she realized, and Emily winced beneath her hand. Samuel's voice cut through the air like steel. "Discipline," he said, his tone calm but carrying across the table. "Is that what you call it?" The table fell silent. Forks stilled, wineglasses hung halfway to lips. All eyes turned toward him. Veronica blinked, her smile faltering. "Darling," she said, laughing lightly, "you make it sound so sinister. Children require guidance. They must learn respect." Samuel leaned forward, his gaze fixed on her, unblinking. "Respect is earned, Veronica, not beaten into them." Gasps rippled through the guests. Veronica's smile broke entirely now, her face hardening. "Samuel," she hissed under her breath, though the words carried in the hush, "don't you dare embarrass me in front of—" "Embarrass you?" His voice rose, steady, commanding. "I should have spoken sooner. I should have opened my eyes years ago. But tonight, everyone here will see you for who you truly are." Emily's wide eyes darted to her father, fear and hope colliding in her small face. Veronica's composure shattered like porcelain dropped on marble. She slammed her glass onto the table, wine spilling across the cloth. "You will not speak to me this way in my house. This is not your house." Samuel's voice boomed, final, unyielding. "This is my house, and these are my children, and I will no longer allow you to poison them with your cruelty." The silence that followed was deafening. Guests shifted uncomfortably, torn between loyalty to their hostess and the authority of the man who owned the roof above their heads. Then came the slip, the moment Samuel had waited for. Veronica, trembling with fury, turned her venom not toward him but toward Emily. She seized the girl's arm, jerking her upright so violently the child cried out. "You ungrateful little rat," she spat, her voice raw, stripped of its charm. "Do you think anyone here cares about you? You'd be nothing without me." The room erupted with gasps. A noblewoman at the far end rose to her feet, horror etched on her face. "My God," she whispered. Samuel was already standing, his chair screeching backward. His voice thundered across the room. "Release her. Now." For a heartbeat, Veronica hesitated, her fingers digging into Emily's fragile arm. Then, under the weight of every eye in the room, she let go. Emily stumbled back, and Samuel was there, pulling her safely into his arms. Enough, he declared, his voice shaking the walls. This masquerade ends tonight. Veronica's face twisted with rage, her emerald gown shimmering as she trembled. You think you can turn them against me? You think you can destroy me with words? Samuel met her fury with calm resolve. No, Veronica. You destroyed yourself. Every bruise on this child's body, every tear you caused, every mask you wore, all of it ends now. I have proof. I have witnesses. And I swear on everything I am, you will never touch them again. The guests murmured, scandalized and stunned. A senator whispered to his wife, he has proof. Lawyers at the far end leaned forward with interest. The cracks in Veronica's empire were no longer invisible. They were wide, gaping, undeniable. Veronica's hands trembled at her sides. Her mask was gone. The perfect wife, the doting mother, the glittering hostess, all had melted away, leaving only the venomous truth. She opened her mouth to lash back, to claw her way out with words, but nothing came. The silence strangled her. Samuel lifted Emily higher into his arms, her small face buried against his chest, and glanced toward Michael, who was already being scooped up by the housekeeper, shielded from the chaos. Then he turned back to his guests, his voice calm but resolute. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this display, but you deserve to know the truth. The woman you see before you has no claim to this house, to these children, or to me. And soon, she will have no claim to the fortune she so desperately covets. The words landed like hammer strikes. Veronica staggered back a step, her face pale beneath the glow of the chandelier. She had fought so hard, worn her mask so tightly, built her empire so carefully, and in one evening, Samuel had stripped it all away. The guests began to rise, some murmuring polite excuses, others openly condemning her. Within minutes, the room that had once been her stage emptied of allies. She stood alone, trembling in the ruins of her facade, while Samuel carried Emily upstairs, his arm wrapped tightly around the daughter he had finally reclaimed. The confrontation was over. The war, however, had only just begun. The mansion no longer hummed with Veronica's laughter. It no longer echoed with the sharp sting of her heels on marble or the false sweetness of her voice drifting through the halls. Instead, it held silence, a silence heavy with aftermath, yet charged with something new, the quiet breath of freedom. The night after the confrontation stretched long and sleepless. Samuel paced his study, a single lamp burning beside stacks of papers, affidavits, and photographs his lawyer had collected. The evidence was overwhelming. Testimonies from staff members who had long feared to speak now spilled freely after what they had witnessed at dinner. Medical records quietly retrieved showed unexplained bruises and injuries Veronica had dismissed as clumsiness. Financial ledgers hinted at her hidden greed, funds siphoned into secret accounts. But more powerful than any document was the memory burned into every guest who had sat at that table. Veronica's mask slipping, her cruelty bared for all to see. She had destroyed herself. Samuel leaned back in his chair, weary but resolute. For years he had been blind, distracted, comfortable in his absence. He had failed Emily and Michael in ways that gnawed at his conscience. But now, staring into the embers of the dying fire, he swore to himself that those days were gone. His children would never again be left unprotected. Meanwhile, Veronica's fury boiled like a storm with no outlet. She locked herself in her gilded chambers, pacing like a caged animal, her silk gown torn from the violent tug she had given Emily. Rage twisted her face in the mirror. How dare he humiliate her? How dare he strip away everything she had worked for? In her mind, she was the victim, betrayed, cornered, cast aside. She swore she would not go quietly. The following morning, Samuel gathered the children in the breakfast room. The sunlight streamed through the tall windows, painting warmth across the table. Emily sat close beside him, her small hand resting cautiously in his. Michael babbled in his high chair, crumbs of bread sticking to his cheeks. For once, there was no tension in the air, no shadow of fear lurking over the meal. Emily, Samuel said softly, turning to her. I need you to hear something from me. She looked up, hesitant, her eyes still carrying the weight of years spent under Veronica's thumb. I should have protected you sooner. I should have seen what was happening. For that, I will carry the guilt always. But listen to me now. I will never let her hurt you again. Not you. Not your brother. You're safe. Do you understand? Tears welled in Emily's eyes, and she nodded slowly. It was not blind trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of healing. And that was enough. That afternoon, the storm broke. Lawyers arrived at the estate, accompanied by officers of the court. Veronica was summoned to the study, where Samuel sat flanked by his counsel. She swept into the room, defiant in a crimson gown, her chin high, her eyes blazing. "This is outrageous," she spat before anyone could speak. "You think you can smear my name, parade me like some criminal in my own home? You'll regret this, Samuel. I will ruin you." Samuel remained calm, his voice steady. "This isn't about me. This is about the children. This is about the truth. And the truth is, you have no place in their lives." His lawyer slid the documents across the desk. Petitions for annulment, restraining orders, custody claims, and most damning of all, the compiled evidence of her abuse. Veronica's hands trembled as she scanned the papers, her face paling with each page. "You can't prove," she began, but her voice faltered. The proof was undeniable. "We can," Samuel interrupted. "And we will." The officers stepped forward. "Mrs. Harrington," one said formally, "you are required to leave these premises immediately. You will comply with the court's temporary removal order until further hearings are completed." For a moment, she stood frozen, her fury choking her. Then, with a sudden scream, she swept the papers off the desk, scattering them like broken glass across the room. "You think you've won," she shrieked. "You'll see. You'll all see. Without me, this house will crumble. Those children will turn against you just as they turned against me." But her words held no power anymore. The staff did not rush to defend her. The children did not cower at her rage. Even Samuel did not flinch. He simply stood, tall and resolute, his voice like iron. "Get out!" The words rang like a final verdict. 2 officers escorted her, her screams echoing down the hall, her heels scraping against the marble like claws against stone. Emily and Michael, watching from the stairwell, clung to one another as Veronica was dragged out the front doors. The slam that followed was more than would meeting frame. It was the sound of an era ending, of chains breaking, of ghosts being expelled. The house exhaled. In the weeks that followed, the Harrington mansion transformed. Curtains once drawn tight were opened to let sunlight flood the halls. Laughter, tentative at first, began to echo in spaces that had known only whispers and fear. Emily slowly unfurled, like a flower long starved of light. She no longer jumped at every creak of the floorboards. She began to smile, small, fragile smiles, when Samuel sat beside her at night, reading aloud until she drifted to sleep. Michael thrived in the warmth of freedom, toddling through the halls with newfound joy, chasing the loyal housekeeper's skirts as if reclaiming the childhood he had nearly lost. Samuel worked tirelessly to repair not just the home, but the bond with his children. He learned to braid Emily's hair, clumsily at first, but with growing care. He taught Michael how to stack blocks, laughing when the boy toppled them over with glee. He was not perfect, grief and guilt still haunted him, but he was present. And for his children, that was everything. Veronica, meanwhile, faded from their lives like a shadow retreating at dawn. Court proceedings stripped her of claims to the estate, and her reputation crumbled in the wake of scandal. The high society she had courted so desperately turned its back on her, her name whispered in corners as a cautionary tale. She had played her game and lost, consumed by her own hunger. One winter evening, months after her departure, Samuel stood once more by the nursery door. Inside, Emily slept soundly beside her brother, their breathing soft and even, their faces untroubled. The sight brought a lump to his throat. He thought of Elizabeth, his first wife, and the promise he had made at her grave. He thought of the mistakes he had made, the blindness that had cost so much. But he also thought of this moment, his children safe, free, and slowly healing. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel peace. As the fire crackled in the hearth and the house settled into quiet, Samuel whispered into the darkness, "We're free." And for once, the silence answered not with dread, but with comfort. Cruelty can wear the mask of elegance. Abuse can hide behind silk and smiles. But truth, once revealed, burns hotter than lies. And even the deepest scars can begin to heal when love is reclaimed, when silence is broken, when a father finally stands for his children. The Harrington family learned that freedom does not come without fire, but from fire, they rose stronger. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. See you in the next one.